they're looking at multiplexes, that's a big question. Am I going to have to get this by my neighbors and they're going to hate this basically? But we've been able to, at least in Vancouver, reassure them that no, it's a simplified development permit process, and that won't be necessary. Is that going to impact these? How's that going to impact these neighborhoods? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's always a value of engagement in the sense of people should really be eyes wide open from a municipal planning department perspective or municipality perspective to understand what's the impact of a particular project in an area. But at the end of the day, we have to have guardrails on that too, where the
Hmm.
reason why projects are being proposed is to build housing in these particular areas.
Hey, I'm Kent with VictorEric Design & Build. Welcome to the Multiplex Shaping Vancouver series, where we invite industry experts to share their perspective and tips on multiplexes and the Gentle Density Initiative. I really hope you like it. Hey everyone, I'm Kent with VictorEric Design & Build, and I'm here with David Cooper. I'm really excited to interview him today. David, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is David Cooper. I'm the principal leading mobility consulting. I've been an urban planner for about 18 years and worked in Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto, mostly in transportation, but dabble in housing policy a fair bit through a lot of work on integrating transit and housing, but also through teaching. I also do at Toronto Metropolitan University, where I do courses on planning policy.
Okay, well, quite the resume, and I'm really excited to get your perspective here on multiplexes. As a planner, I think one of the things I'm most interested in, from your perspective, is the societal implications of these new initiatives we're seeing in Vancouver and across the country. Just kind of talking about, the impact on our cities and everyday life.
So the housing conversation has morphed and changed so much, maybe in the last 5 years, than I've seen in almost the last 20. I think a lot of that is really driving from really the cost of affordability. And it's not something that we're just seeing in Vancouver. We're seeing it in Toronto for a period of time. We're seeing increased housing prices in Alberta, increased housing prices in Montreal, and really all across Canada, especially in our urban centers. And what's been interesting to see in Vancouver is that you have very interesting land economics. You have obviously a lot of constraints where you have a US border to the south, you got mountains to the north, you got an ocean to the west, but also you have a lot of high density urban centers that have really grown in over time through pretty integrated regional plans, but also you have an agricultural land reserve and you have all these different kind of compounding things that have really restricted land supply for, obviously natural, agricultural, and other type of urban development reasons. So we've seen these pressures into seeing what kind of different kind of housing policies will change, and how does that also tie into transportation? How does it tie into other things, other facets of livability has been a huge conversation in BC.
Nice. And transportation is a huge part of this, so I'm excited to ask you about that in a minute. And you mentioned Montreal, where I lived for years, and it always struck me. I mean, rent was always really cheap there compared to Vancouver. I came from Vancouver and started renting there, and it was so surprising to me just how much less it was there, how affordable it was. And if you look around that city, it's dense. It's townhouse style apartments. For a whole city compared to Vancouver's single family houses. And thinking back now, it seems evident that rents were lower, but like you said, they're now experiencing a housing crisis similar to the rest of the country. So that's pretty interesting. Will multiplexes solve the housing crisis?
So what's interesting actually with that Montreal example, and I'll pivot back to BC, is that when you go around Montreal, you'll see that there's actually a lot of the small scale multi-unit housing. You go into the plateau and you'll see several units built on top of each other, or you might have units kind of back to back, where you've had that kind of medium style density in an area where you have, grid streets, access to cycling facilities, the metro system, things like that. And you've already had that kind of organic growth of multiplexes in Montreal, and which really led to a diverse housing stock. You see way less towers, you see more opportunity to live in different forms. And now we're kind of seeing that rear its head in other parts of Canada, especially in BC. What's been really interesting from a policy perspective is that the province recently came out with a series of pretty significant planning policy interventions. One is about the small scale multi-unit housing, and the other one's about transit-oriented development. And when we
Mhm.
look at small scale housing, we're talking about secondary suites in your single family dwelling. We're talking about detached accessory dwellings. We're talking about duplexes, either side by side or on top of each other. We're talking about triplexes, houseplexes, townhomes. And what's really interesting to see on this is that, especially in Metro Vancouver, our urban areas built out. And when we look at the land use in the residential areas, about 70 to 85% is single family dwellings. And if you want to keep having the growth of another million residents into Metro Vancouver, which is what's already projected for the next 30 years, and you want to have that economic activity in that development, we got to find different ways to house people on the same amount of land.
Mhm.
And what we see is, you go to the West End and you see nothing but towers almost, and that has kind of grown over time through different policy. But there's huge swaths of land throughout Metro Vancouver where you have single family dwellings. And
Mhm.
I'm not one to suggest, hey, we should build towers in the middle of a neighborhood. It's more like we need to find ways to incrementally and provide kind of that unlocking of the ability to do these multi-unit housing units. And we're seeing a lot of policies coming in that really take away some of the barriers to entry into actually doing that. Because at the end of the day, we don't have new land to build on. Well, being my hometown, yes. I
Yeah.
think the challenge that we're seeing is that you've had to have more blunt policy instruments used in BC because, again, the land supply is a legitimate issue, and you have a lot of economic growth. You have a lot of people that want to come to BC. You want to, start a life or, have that opportunity to do so. Land economics are a bit different, maybe I'd say in the prairie cities, but we also have this scenario right now where people are leaving BC and Ontario and coming to Alberta. And for us in Alberta, you wouldn't want to have everyone just move to a single family dwelling outside the ring road in either Edmonton or Calgary. That would be quite disastrous from an urban planning perspective, but you want to have those abilities to have other types of units. And one of the things that's been really challenging with the multiplex, I'll give Calgary as an example. Calgary really struggled in actually getting secondary suites approved for many years.
Hmm.
And the reason for that wasn't so much that people didn't want to age in place and didn't want to have their multi-generations of a family in one unit. People were worried about things like street parking. People were worried
Mhm.
about kind of the externalities of having additional neighbors. But I think we're past that point now where it's pretty accepted that access to housing is something that is a critical need for several generations right now. But then also, our ability to grow the cities that we've had in a way that we've been growing in a very suburban context is not going to work. I took a class of mine from Toronto to Vancouver right before the pandemic, and one of the most interesting, commentary we had is that I purposely spent a good chunk of time. We went out to Surrey and Langley. We met with members of the development community and members of kind of more the local planning area, and they said, at the end of the day, our last single family neighborhoods are being developed right now in certain parts of Langley Township or certain parts of Midford, and that's it. And the only way that you can actually accommodate this growth is through the small scale multi-unit housing. And one of the things that is really challenging from the municipal perspective is that the municipal plan departments and city councils are the land use planning authority. But if you want to have these kind of more significant changes at more of a macro scale, the province is going to have to get involved. And we've seen that where they've reduced really the barriers of entry from a policy perspective to build these different types of diverse housing units all across really BC. Like at the end of the day, like we're also seeing these pressures in Kelowna and Victoria and Nanaimo and other places too, and
Mhm.
having that ability to get a faster way to get an approval or not to have to do zoning amendments and land use changes all the time. We can actually do this as of right is pretty significant, especially in BC.
Okay, awesome. I'm really curious because you've already mentioned the new provincial policies, small scale multi-unit housing, and that's being rolled out to all the cities, but they're having to follow through and do the work and implement it on their own terms. How are these being implemented successfully, or how do you see them being implemented successfully? What or how could they be improved, especially improved on, say, what Vancouver is doing? Like, how can we encourage these cities to build more of that housing using the same, overarching policy?
Well, I think what people think is good policy when I first started as a planner versus now in housing is very different, right? Like, I think people need to accept the fact that we are in a crisis, and there's certain things that you need to do that are pretty blunt and sometimes drastic into changing some of your land use regulations. And when you start saying, hey, in your single family development neighborhood, that you can start building triplexes and multiplexes and all these different types of units on your sites, those will change those neighborhoods.
Hmm.
And there will be obviously impacts, but also the ability for people to, you'll have growth in these areas. If you have growth in these areas, there's several inner city neighborhoods I could think of that have schools that close down because there's not enough population density
Hmm.
of kids to go to school. That kind of started solving that. We have areas that where sometimes the commercial vitality of the nearby commercial corridor is a bit challenged because you don't have that market that goes there.
Hmm.
You start densifying some of these areas, you start building an uplift on demand for transit, you get more frequent transit service, right?
Hmm.
So, the more people you put into a neighborhood that actually have that access to housing, the more amenities that you actually generally get.
Hmm.
But the big dilemma and the big debate has always been kind of protecting, walling off these areas so you can't do that and they stay static in time. An
Hmm.
area that stays static in time is an area that dies. And one of the favorite philosophies in urban planning is that an area that changes is the one that usually gets those catalytic investments, or the ones that get
Hmm.
they're the ones that kind of grow and shape and really become a destination, a driver for where people want to go. And that's
Hmm.
where also those amenities and services and other things that really improve your livability go. And the big barrier has been on policy, and we're seeing the province come in and say, as of right, you can do this. And that's
Yeah.
pretty significant. That's something that we have not seen. Ontario is not doing that.
Hmm.
Certain cities are doing 4 units as of right, but the province is not mandating for the rest of the province for
Hmm.
some reason. Like there's several differing things that are out there saying how much housing you need. Like for instance, by 2030, like the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation has said, we need 6 million new homes, and we're only
Hmm.
on track to build 2.5 million of them, right? So, and I think a lot of it is that we don't have the policies in place
Hmm.
to unlock our ability to actually deliver these homes in a lot of areas where that can actually use a bit of an uplift in density. And it
Hmm.
wouldn't destroy the neighborhood, it wouldn't destroy the character of it. It actually would add more people to the vitality of these areas. And I think that's a shift of the conversation that we need to have at a very local level.
So are we talking, when specifically, what type of policies do you mean? You mean like on a municipal scale, policies that will allow those municipalities to facilitate that density in specific neighborhoods? Are we talking like policies around parking, for example, or you mentioned land use, like what specifically?
Well, I think when you make things as of right, you make things a lot easier to actually build and construct. Like one of the biggest challenges and why we see developers love doing suburban developments in some more greenfield cities is that one, like, the policies are in place to streamline the approvals process for those types of units.
Hmm.
Two, you don't have, when you're in an established community, there's obviously a series of engagement and things that you need to have with the overall community, but sometimes engagement does spur other things that might create tension points within the creation of new housing within a particular area. But at
Hmm.
the end of the day, like when you have, like, you need to do some drastic things when it comes to housing. the more barriers you remove from policy perspective, the faster it is to actually get approval to build these units. At the
Hmm.
end of the day, if somebody walks into City Hall today and
Hmm.
says, "Hey, I want to get a development permit for X site, and I want to build X amount of units, or this is the types of things I'm going to do within my permitted land use," I still, you're still looking at from the day of submitting that application to the day that someone moves in, it's 4 to 5 years.
Yeah.
And if you require any sort of zoning amendment or official community plan amendment or something like that,
Hmm.
depending where you're in the jurisdiction, you're just adding time. And then when you add time to that, you're adding cost to the overall project because the value of money over time, the soft cost and the financing interplay that goes on at the same time.
Hmm.
So the more things that we can do to reduce those barriers to build the housing, to build that really that policy pathway to get there, the more likely we are going to have the ability to actually get those units constructed. And when you
Hmm.
simplify things such as, let's say the triplexes, the fourplexes, and all that in these areas, it's going to make life a lot easier to actually get these units built.
Yeah, that really strikes me that, um, yeah, the lead time on actual construction for all that soft work is so long, especially for a larger apartment building. And in Vancouver, at least with multiplexes, to get the building and development permits, we haven't seen any come through yet. It's still a new policy, but we're hoping it's going to be within a year, maybe less. And that's what the city has reassured us. And we're getting feedback on some of the designs that we've submitted already pretty quickly. It's been reassuring. So yeah, that's fewer units overall, like per development, but if they can get developed a lot faster. And the other thing about that lead time is that's just costing people money. So, if a big developer buys a big lot to build whatever it is, 30, 50 units, something like that, and
Mm-hmm.
they have to sit on
Mm-hmm.
that for years, like that's just burning a hole in their pocket and costing them tons of money. And that's costing, the consumers at the end of the day. So yeah, that's
Well,
really,
it also costs the viability of the project. Like every time
yeah,
we've had an
exactly.
interest rate, every time there's been an interest rate increase, developers, the feasibility of actually constructing the project goes down. And there's a lot of projects that are in limbo right now because we had that, the duration of time to get things approved, but then also the rise of interest rates and all these other things kind of factor into freezing your ability to actually build the housing on the site if you're not careful.
And a lot of people, something I want to ask you a little bit about, I'm sure you've been involved with here and there, is engagement. Because a lot of people ask us as um, they're looking at multiplexes. That's a big question. Am I going to have to get this by my neighbors, and they're going to hate this basically? But we've been able to, at least in Vancouver, reassure them that no, it's a simplified development permit process, and that won't be necessary. But is that going to impact these? How's that going to impact these neighborhoods? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's always a value of engagement in the sense of people should really be eyes wide open from a municipal planning department perspective or municipality perspective to understand what's the impact of a particular project in an area. But at the end of the day, we have to have guardrails on that too, where the
Mm.
reason why projects are being proposed is to build housing in these particular areas. And one of the challenges that I find with public meetings, and I've had this on several different projects, is that you typically get 4 times as many people at the meeting that don't want something versus one time,
Yeah.
versus kind of the one small cohort of people that want something to occur on that particular area, be it a transit project, be it a housing project, be it, urban planning initiative, things like that.
Mhm.
And one of the things that is really challenging, I think, on the housing conversation is that, we're trying to build housing for people to actually access the market. And there's been this really negative kind of connotation where you have a lot of these public meetings where people who own homes come to them and say, hey, like we don't want to have additional density, we don't want to change their neighborhood. And then
Mhm.
we have individuals who would actually benefit from the housing in these areas and they're renters and they don't go to the meetings because one, they don't even know if they're going to have tenure in the area or
Mhm.
even continue to live there. And then two, if they go there, they get dismissed by the homeowners in the first place. And I've seen some
Mhm.
pretty really troublesome behaviors and kind of
Mhm.
dialogue on that particular type of the conversation, unfortunately. And a
People
lot of
say,
it is
"Oh, you're just
because,
a renter."
yeah,
Yeah.
you're just a renter and you get dismissed as that, right?
Mhm.
So That's one of the things that is really challenging. At the end of the day, we need to put guardrails on, like, here's the things that we know are approved and applicable in this particular area. Here's some of the things that we can do to, let's say, mitigate particular issues, be it maybe a shadow thing or parking thing or something on noise and vibration mitigation or X, Y, and Z. But that's it. Like, I don't think that we need to be going through these onerous processes on this, because at the end of the day, we need to build housing. We need shovels in the ground, not people debating why we need something. It's like the time to move on is now. And that's something I think we're starting to see more of a dialogue and more action towards in other places. Also looking at some of the policies and procedures on how do we actually deal with kind of the overall process on this is actually just as important as the policy change.
Yeah, simplifying the process, saving time. Yeah, that feedback, that community aspect, it just seems like a harder and harder position to defend, to say, I don't want new housing in my neighborhood.
Or I want housing, just not here. Like,
Right. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think
Build the housing, just not next door.
just not next door. And I think the credibility of that debate ends at that point. Like, at the end of the day, like, people are moving to our cities, people want to contribute to our collective society. You cannot do that unless you have somewhere to live. And everyone needs to play a bit of a piece and roll into that.
Okay, so maybe I'll lob you a question related to transit, and I'm really curious about parking minimums and parking in general. You mentioned these, how engagement can work. Earlier you mentioned street parking as people being in opposition to projects because of that. But we've seen now parking minimums decreased. In Vancouver, there are none for multiplex. And the new regulations from the province, I think they've limited it somehow. It might be like, I know Burnaby, it's like half a spot per unit or something like that. So it's quite a bit lower than we've seen in the past. And I'm curious, how is parking playing into this, and how is it related to transit?
So I guess parking has a lot of interplay with transit. We've seen a lot of cities that have moved away from parking minimums. I know Edmonton's done that, Toronto's done that. Lower Mainland is definitely looking into this. At the end of the day, if you provide parking supply, it's kind of like a carrot and stick with transit, right? Like, if you actually have high quality transit that's frequent, reliable all day, connects you to where you want to go, married that with also a bit of a stick on, like, the reduced parking supply through a parking minimum, your ability to actually pivot that person to transit's much higher. And I guess the logic behind the whole thing is that if you're already in a transit area, why do you need the parking? And one of the things that's been very interesting to see in Metro Vancouver is that when you look at long-term regional plans across the region, you've seen a lot of densification. You can tell where the expo line goes from the skyline, because you can see the pockets of density along the SkyTrain stations, especially at, like, Joyce, Patterson, Metrotown are really good examples of that.
Yeah.
And when you have that access to high quality transit, it should be your first and preferred choice. But if you don't disincentivize, in a way, other ways of getting around, we can't pivot you there. Right. So that is a huge component to that. And then also, people have leveraged parking as a bit of an opposition tool, because, let's say, there's this really bad habit I've noticed over the years where people think the on-street parking in front of their house belongs to them. It doesn't. And I've had several debates with people in public meetings, on the phone, and just discussions that is a public street right away. Like, that is not your parking spot. And I think, if we're in areas where you have that high transit utilization and you don't need that parking stall, nor you don't get one, it just makes our life easier for you to actually pivot to transit. But then the onus is still on the city or the regional transportation authority. In the case of Metro Vancouver, is that it only works if you have that high quality of service, which has a feedback loop. So if you have the high quality of service that's all day, all night, and you have the high ridership to feed it, you can sustain it. Right? Like, cities are not in the situation where, okay, let's say you don't put there's no parking minimums. But if you don't actually have a baseline level of service that's attractive, you can't pivot people over, right? So, but you'll never be cities are not in the financial capacity to put in the high quality service first to attract everyone over, versus, converting, let's say, a bus service to a SkyTrain in an area that was, we're seeing this on Broadway. They're building the Broadway extension right now.
Mhm.
You'll see more of that where it's like the ridership's already there and sustained to convert over. So, the onus is, yes, have that policy tool on the parking minimum, but then also you still need to have that high access to transit. In order to do that, you need the ridership, and you also need an adequate funding model, which has been a huge conversation from
Mm.
TransLink and Metro Vancouver on how do we actually have that funding model to sustain our operations. And that's a pretty significant conversation for them right now.
Okay, interesting. So you're kind of talking about, and Bill 47, BC Bill 47 is related to that, transit-oriented areas, how to get more density around the high quality transit we already have around places like the Nanaimo station or close where I live, even Broadway and Commercial. It's astounding. There's there's like 2 buildings that are over, say, 12 stories, and that's about it. And so the density in housing can follow, where these high quality transit stations exist. But I'm wondering if there's a feedback in the other way. Is that what they're planning with multiplex? Are they densifying areas that they're expect to then bring high transit to, or will these dense areas just attract higher quality transit in the future?
Well, I think one of the challenges with the transit areas is that we have an existing SkyTrain system. Some stations have had significant density. Go to Lougheed, go to Metrotown, go to Yaletown Roundhouse. Oak Ridge is getting a pretty significant TOD, but then we also have some that don't, and some of it could be servicing limitations. I know has been an issue in the Nanaimo station for a long time.
Hmm.
Sometimes the neighborhood plan conflicts with more of a broader regional vision, which has been the issue of Commercial Broadway. And
Hmm.
I think the purpose of the TOAs is, if you're in the immediate realm, let's say 200 meters or less of a SkyTrain station, you get a minimum allowable height of 20 stories. And then it goes down to 12 once you're more than 200 to 400. It goes down to 8 when you're kind of like the wedding cake or layer cake
Hmm.
type urban form and structure from that. I think the purpose of this policy is to again reduce some of those barriers to getting these sites on. I
Hmm.
think the complexity that occurs is that, okay, when you start saying, hey, this 20-story tower is as of right, you still need to create development charges and fees to pay for the water and sewer hookups. You still
Hmm.
need community amenity contributions when it goes to things such as your parks and public spaces. You still need the ability to have that supportive infrastructure in place. And
Hmm.
I think one of the I like the idea of this policy in principle,
Hmm.
but also when you have a minimum height that's 20 stories, you start kind of getting into this renegotiation of density bonusing. Be it let's say a developer wants to come in and say, hey, I want to build additional units and heights, and there's a negotiation with the city depending on what type of amenities or cash contributions or cash in lieu that the city
Hmm.
can get for those. So I think that's being revisited, but at the end of the day, we're building multi-billion-dollar infrastructure, especially with SkyTrain. We should be
Hmm.
doing everything possible to have that housing and transit connectivity, which we see in Metro Vancouver, actually more so than any other place in Canada, but there's still room for improvement on that. And at the end of the day, from the transit system perspective, we need to get people on those trains
Yeah.
from a ridership perspective, from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, from a livability perspective, and all those types of things. And having those units and at least those minimum densities at a start will be helpful on that. But we still need to address some of the challenges that we see with the infrastructure connectivity and the infrastructure costing when it comes to actually making these sites developable to actually do this.
Interesting. Now, thinking specifically about multiplex, I'm curious, the cities are seem to be changing rapidly. At least, that's the policy landscape right now. Are these going to be desirable units in multiplexes? And how long will it take them to really make an impact on the city in terms of density?
I think any sort of land use play takes time to actually see the impact of it. You know, from a transit perspective, I would say, hey, like if we can start setting the table for some of these more transit and housing integrated land use policies, it's a long play. These are things we'll see in 5, 10, 15, 20 years to see the
Mhm.
actual benefits realization of it. I think from the multiplex perspective, at the end of the day, if we actually start getting the ability to build these units in the neighborhoods, we actually start getting the population growth in these areas, that they're not hollowing out. I think over time you will see those benefits. You'll see the benefits of actually, you know, keeping your school open. You'll see the benefit of actually having more vitality on those commercial corridors.
Mhm.
There is a tie in the multiplex legislation in BC to frequent transit. You know, if you're living on the Fraser Street bus, you're not living on a SkyTrain, you're living on a bus.
Mhm.
And if you can start seeing the growth of multiplexes in some of these areas around that bus route, our ability to actually increase the service on that route because we have higher demand is presented to us, right? So over time. So, you know, it's hard to say like, you know, how much time would it take to actually accommodate that? At the end of the day, too, if you start actually unlocking your ability to have supply, hopefully there is a positive ability to have a positive relationship with housing values and rental costs,
Mhm.
right? Like a big driver of why we have such high home prices and such high rental costs because we don't have supply, and
Mhm.
supply is inhibited by the land, which is also inhibited by a whole bunch of the land's also inhibited by a bunch of encumbering policies such as the protectionism of single family homes. So
Yeah.
I think you'll see this whole cyclical, you know, conversation and policy implications and changes come to, you know, some positive fruition for additional housing units, hopefully additional affordability, better access and services in your own communities, you know, transit ridership, all those things. I
Mhm.
think in the short to medium term, you know, I'd say hopefully within the next 5 years.
Very, very cool. And where, now that we're forward looking, like where do we go from here? That the province in BC, I feel like is very progressive on this issue. Ontario's not quite there yet. In Alberta, that seems like certain cities are moving forward with higher density and single family neighborhoods. It's being talked about federally, like, and then there's the transit oriented areas, which is a huge amount of density that we're about to see in Vancouver and the region, we think. What's next? Like, are we going to see those transit-oriented areas expand? Are the multiplexes going to turn to row houses? Like, where's this all going?
So I think there's a few things. One, to see the policies come to fruition is going to take some time. Two, I think having that path to understand you need time to also see the impact of it, right? And one of the things that we still need to work on is getting these approved faster. Like
Hmm.
we still have very long, drawn out processes when it comes to approving housing units. And this is not just the BC thing, this is an everywhere thing. And one of the things that I want to see is that, and I worked for the planning department of the city of Toronto for a portion of my career, and you know we've had some conversation on this, and I want to see this. If you're a developer that's coming in and you're saying, hey, I want to build multiplexes on a high frequency transit, or hey, I want to build, let's say, even affordable housing at a SkyTrain station, we should be doing everything possible internally at City Hall to part the seas and make this happen.
Hmm.
And I think that philosophy change is actually quite significant and something that needs to be done. And I think just having the ability to empower our planners to get these things done in a more fast, effective, efficient manner is pretty significant and huge. And I think one of the other things, and I know some of the mayors have commented on this too, is that it is one thing to say, hey, you can build these types of units and you can build these types of projects, but there's still the upstream and downstream impacts on the infrastructure. There has been some funding announced by the federal government for like a housing infrastructure fund to fund things that would, like, let's say, sewer and water to help facilitate some of the building of these projects.
Hmm.
But at the same time, like, we need to get shovels in the ground. We need to find ways to reduce the processes, reduce the barriers, reduce the timelines, but also make sure that we don't pass on all these other costs onto consumers as well to actually get these units built. So there's a bit of a dance where everything has to work together. But we also need time. And having a consistent, solid framework of policy changes and process changes is helpful.
Mhm.
Some jurisdictions keep changing things all the time because they're in a panic mode. That is not helpful. So I think we need to start looking internally of how we actually get the stuff approved faster, to get the shovels in the ground to reduce those soft costs. I think that's actually a pretty huge thing on this right now.
Yeah. And as a company helping folks get these things approved and build them, we're seeing some pretty promising things from City Hall, at least in Vancouver. Burnaby has traditionally been a little quicker to approve things, and now they've slowed down, or we're expecting them to anyways, because they're implementing the changes now. Vancouver's already done that. And the changes kind of forced upon them, I guess you could say, a bit more quickly. I've learned a lot so far. I've gotten a lot out of this. I'm wondering, is there anything else you want to add? Anything off the top of your head that you're thinking about, multiplexes or something you want to throw in there we haven't spoken about yet?
I think the multiplex is going to be an interesting evolution in our neighborhoods. I think it's something that it's a stepping stone and something that should be done. And I really hope for positive outcomes that come out of this from the regulatory changes we're seeing in BC, because a lot of people are watching and they want to see, is this actually working for serving market demand? Is it helping to create additional housing units? Is it helping to solve some of the affordability pieces? And we're all very curious and keen to watch and find out.
Nice, exciting. So David Cooper, planner, professor, consultant, how can our audience connect with you?
I have a website, leadingmobility.com. There's a contact form if you want to get a hold of me. I'm always happy to chat about, especially the integration of transit and housing. Lots of really cool work going on in that in Metro Vancouver, across in Canada, and totally happy to have that conversation with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David, and looking forward to connecting soon.
Great. Thanks for having me, Ken.
Hey, I really hope you enjoyed that interview with David Cooper. If you haven't already done it, check out our YouTube channel. There's so many great tips on there. Also, make sure you're subscribed. We're bringing on lots of experts to share their viewpoints on the topic of multiplexes in our Multiplexes Shaping Vancouver series. We are VictorEric Design+Build, and we create amazing spaces.